play the Duchess, or I'll lose everything. In New York, the Duke begs a journalist, and a cold deal turns into a romance no one can ever find out about. The fluorescent lights of the newsroom buzzed with their usual merciless intensity as Laura Bennett stared at the blinking cursor on her computer screen. 27 years old, and already she could feel the weight of professional mortality pressing against her shoulders like an old coat that no longer fit. Bennett. The voice cut through the ambient hum of keyboards and hushed phone conversations. David Marshall, editor-in-chief, stood beside her cubicle with the expression of a man who'd rather be anywhere else. My office. Now. Laura's stomach tightened. She'd been expecting this conversation for weeks, watching as her bylines grew scarcer and her assignments shifted from investigations to fluff pieces. The lawsuit from her exposé on construction fraud 6 months ago had made her radioactive. Not because she'd been wrong, but because proving she was right would cost more than the paper could afford. In David's glass-walled office, she sat across from him as he shuffled papers with unnecessary precision. Behind him, Manhattan sprawled in all its unforgiving glory, steel and glass reaching toward a sky that seemed perpetually gray. Laura, you're good at what you do. His words carried the weight of an inevitable, but the problem is that what you do has become expensive. She'd rehearsed this moment, but the reality still felt like ice water in her veins. How long do I have? End of the month. David's eyes finally met hers. I'm sorry, if it were up to me, but it's not. Laura stood, her chair rolling back on its wheels. I understand. Outside his office, she gathered her belongings with mechanical precision. 27 years old, and she was already learning the bitter arithmetic of New York. Talent minus timing equals irrelevance. The September afternoon air carried the scent of roasted nuts and car exhaust as Laura emerged onto the street. Her phone buzzed, a text from her landlord about next month's rent. Another puzzle piece in the increasingly complex geometry of her unraveling life. She walked without direction, her mind cycling through possibilities that grew bleaker with each passing block. The city moved around her with its usual indifference, everyone rushing toward destinations that seemed infinitely more certain than her own. It was near Midtown, in front of a building whose lobby gleamed with the kind of money that never worried about monthly rent, that her phone rang. Unknown number. Laura Bennett? Speaking. My name is Alexander Carlyle. I believe we have something to discuss. The voice was crisp, British, and carried an authority that made her pause mid-stride. I'm sorry. Do we know each other? Not yet. But I know who you are, and more importantly, I know what you need. Laura's journalistic instincts sharpened. Which is a solution to your current predicament. I'm standing across the street from you, Miss Bennett. The black car. She turned, scanning the traffic until she spotted a sleek sedan with tinted windows. A figure in a dark suit stood beside it, phone pressed to his ear. Even from a distance, she could sense the careful precision in his posture. This is either very impressive surveillance or an elaborate joke, she said into the phone. Neither. It's a proposition. There was a pause, one that could change both our circumstances significantly. Against every instinct that had kept her alive in journalism's shark-infested waters, Laura found herself curious. What kind of proposition? The kind that requires privacy. Will you join me for coffee? Laura looked around at the bustling street, at the building behind her that represented everything she couldn't afford, at the life that seemed to be crumbling with each passing hour. Sometimes, she thought, the most dangerous choices were also the most necessary ones. There's a cafe on the corner, she said finally. 5 minutes. The line went dead, and Laura watched as the figure across the street moved with fluid purpose toward the intersection. She had no idea who Alexander Carlyle was or what he wanted, but she knew with crystalline certainty that her old life had just ended. Now, standing on a sidewalk in Manhattan with nowhere left to fall, she was about to discover what would rise from its ashes. The city hummed around her, indifferent as always, as Laura Bennett walked toward whatever came next. The cafe was the kind of place that survived in Manhattan through sheer stubbornness. Mismatched furniture, coffee that was strong rather than artisanal, and the blessed anonymity that came from being unremarkable. Laura chose a corner table, positioning herself where she could watch both the entrance and the street beyond. Alexander Carlyle entered with the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to being the most important person in any room. Tall, perhaps 35, with dark hair and the kind of bearing that spoke of expensive schools and inherited expectations. His suit was perfectly tailored without being ostentatious, and when their eyes met across the cafe, Laura felt the unsettling sensation of being truly seen. He ordered black coffee and approached her table with measured steps. "Miss Bennet." He extended his hand as he sat. "Thank you for agreeing to meet." His handshake was firm, brief, businesslike. Up close, she could see the fine lines around his eyes that suggested someone who smiled less than he should, and the careful way he positioned himself in the chair, like a man always ready to leave. "You know who I am," Laura said, wrapping her hand around her coffee cup. "But I have no idea who you are, beyond a name and an expensive car." "Alexander Carlyle, the Duke of Winthorne." He said it matter-of-factly, the way another person might mention their profession. "I manage certain international holdings and serve on various boards that oversee significant financial interests." Laura's journalist brain immediately began cataloging questions. "And you sought me out because you're about to lose your job, your apartment, and quite possibly your career." His directness was startling. "And because I need someone with your particular combination of intelligence, discretion, and current desperation." The words stung because they were accurate. "You certainly know how to charm a woman." Something that might have been amusement flickered in his eyes. "Charm is a luxury I can't afford. Neither of us has time for pretense, Miss Bennet." Laura studied his face, searching for tells. "What is it you think I need?" "Legal protection from your current lawsuit. Financial stability. Professional rehabilitation." He paused. "A future that doesn't require you to choose between integrity and survival." And in exchange, Alexander was quiet for a long moment, and Laura had the sense of watching someone step carefully across thin ice. "I need a wife." The words hung in the air between them like a challenge. Laura set down her coffee cup with deliberate precision. "Excuse me, not a real marriage. A performance. A carefully crafted illusion designed to satisfy certain institutional requirements." His voice remained steady, but she caught the slight tension in his jaw. "There are contracts and obligations tied to my position that require the appearance of stability. Personal stability." Laura felt a laugh building in her chest, the kind that bordered on hysteria. "You're asking me to fake marry you. I'm offering you a business arrangement that would solve both our problems." Alexander leaned forward slightly. "You will be compensated generously, protected legally, and given access to circles that could revitalize your career. All you would need to do is play a role. For how long? Long enough to satisfy the requirements. Perhaps a year. Perhaps longer." The vagueness should have been a red flag, but Laura found herself calculating instead of dismissing. A year of financial security. Time to rebuild her reputation. Legal protection from the lawsuit that was slowly strangling her career. "Why me?" she asked finally. "Because you're unknown to my world, but credible to the outside observer. Because you're intelligent enough to learn quickly and desperate enough to commit fully." He paused. "And because when I research your work, I found someone who understands the value of protecting difficult truths." Laura felt exposed under his gaze, as if he could see through all her carefully constructed defenses. "This is insane." "Yes," Alexander agreed. "But it's also practical and profitable." A businessman in an expensive suit brushed past their table, speaking loudly into his phone about quarterly projections and market volatility. The ordinary sounds of the cafe, clinking cups, muffled conversations, the hiss of the espresso machine, continued around them while Laura contemplated a choice that would upend everything she thought she knew about her life. "I would need guarantees," she heard herself say. "Legal protections. Boundaries. Of course. And I would need to understand exactly what I'm protecting you from." Alexander's expression grew carefully neutral. "That would be part of the arrangement. Full disclosure, but only after you've committed. It was a reporter's nightmare, agreeing to a story before knowing its scope. But looking across the table at this stranger who somehow knew her better than most people she'd worked with for years, Laura felt the strange pull of a door opening when all others seemed to be slamming shut. "I need time to think." Alexander nodded and reached into his jacket, producing a card with only a phone number printed on expensive stock. 24 hours, Miss Bennett. After that, I'll need to explore other options." He stood, leaving exact change on the table. "For what it's worth, I believe you're exactly what I need. The question is whether I'm what you need." Laura watched him walk away, noting the way other patrons' eyes followed him without quite knowing why. When he disappeared into the street traffic, she was left alone with a business card and the growing certainty that her safe, predictable world had just become infinitely more complicated. Outside, Manhattan continued its relentless pace, indifferent to the fact that Laura Bennett was about to make the most dangerous decision of her life. Laura spent the night staring at her laptop screen, the cursor blinking mockingly in an empty document titled Reasons to Say No. Each time she began typing, Alexander Carlyle's words echoed in her mind, desperate enough to commit fully. The truth was a blade that cut both ways. She was desperate, and he knew it. At 6 a.m., her phone buzzed with a text from her landlord. "Eviction notice filed. You have 30 days. The arithmetic was simple and brutal. Without a job, without savings, without prospects, she had perhaps 3 weeks before she'd be sleeping on friends' couches, assuming any of them would risk association with someone carrying legal baggage. She called the number on Alexander's card at exactly 9 o'clock. "Miss Bennett." His voice carried no surprise, as if he'd been expecting her call at precisely this moment. "I need to see the contract." "Of course. Can you be at the Meridian Building in an hour?" 42nd floor. The Meridian Building rose from Manhattan's core like a steel and glass monument to the kind of wealth that operated beyond ordinary understanding. The lobby was all marble and understated luxury, the kind of space designed to remind visitors of their place in the hierarchy. On the 40th floor, a receptionist with perfect posture and a smile that never reached her eyes directed Laura to a conference room where Alexander waited with another man. Older, silver-haired, carrying the particular authority that came from decades of making other people's problems disappear. "Miss Bennett, this is Jonathan Hartwell, my attorney." Alexander gestured to the man, who stood to shake her hand. "He'll explain the terms." The contract was 23 pages of legal language that essentially boiled down to an elegant form of prostitution, not of the body, but of identity. Laura would become Mrs. Alexander Carlyle for all public purposes. She would attend events, maintain residence in his apartment, and present the image of a stable, committed marriage to satisfy the requirements of various international boards and investment groups that controlled significant portions of Alexander's inheritance and business interests. "The compensation is substantial," Hartwell explained, sliding another document across the polished table. $600,000 for the first year, with performance bonuses tied to specific milestones. Laura's hands remained steady as she reviewed the numbers, though her heart was racing. More money than she'd made in her entire career combined. "Performance bonuses?" she asked. "Public appearances that are particularly successful. Media coverage that reinforces the narrative. There are specific benchmarks outlined in Appendix C." She flipped to the appendix and found a detailed breakdown that read like a marketing plan for a political campaign. Photo opportunities, interview guidelines, social functions ranked by importance and potential impact. "What about my career?" Alexander leaned forward. "You would continue working as a journalist, but with certain restrictions. No investigations that could create conflicts of interest with my business dealings. No pieces that could damage the carefully constructed image we're building." It was the death of everything she'd trained for, packaged in financial security and tied with a bow of respectability. "And the timeline? Minimum 1 year, Hartwell said, with options for extension based on mutual agreement and ongoing requirements." "What requirements?" Alexander and his attorney exchanged a look that lasted perhaps 2 seconds too long. "There are family complications," Alexander said finally. rivals for certain positions and inheritances who would benefit from any appearance of instability in my personal life. Your presence would neutralize those concerns. Laura set down the contract. I'm not just getting a husband. I'm getting his enemies. You're getting protection from those enemies, Alexander corrected, and the resources to ensure that protection is effective. She thought of her empty bank account, the eviction notice, the lawsuit that followed her like a shadow. Then she looked across the table at this man who was offering her a lifeline wrapped in complications she couldn't yet understand. I have conditions. Name them. Separate bedrooms. No physical intimacy beyond what's required for public appearances. Complete transparency about what I'm being protected from and who wants to hurt you. She paused. And an exit clause. If I want out, I get out. Hartwell was already making notes. The exit clause would require 60 days' notice and certain non-disclosure agreements that would remain in effect indefinitely. Done. Laura looked directly at Alexander. When would this start? This afternoon, if you're willing. There's a board meeting tomorrow that would benefit from your presence. The speed was dizzying. 12 hours ago, she'd been an unemployed journalist with nowhere to live. Now she was being asked to step into a life that existed in the space between truth and performance, where survival required becoming someone else entirely. One more thing, she said. I want to understand exactly who I'm becoming. Not just the role, the woman. Her background, her story, how she met you. If I'm going to lie convincingly, I need to know what I'm lying about. Alexander smiled for the first time since she'd met him, and the expression transformed his face completely. Miss Bennett, I think you're going to be exactly what I need. 2 hours later, Laura Bennett signed her name to a contract that would either save her life or end it entirely. As she walked out of the Meridian building with a new identity and a bank account that had just acquired more zeros than she'd ever imagined, she caught her reflection in the building's gleaming windows. The woman looking back at her was a stranger, someone who'd just agreed to marry a man she barely knew for reasons she didn't fully understand. But for the first time in months, that stranger wasn't afraid. The apartment occupied the top floor of a building that whispered rather than shouted its wealth. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a view of Central Park that real estate agents would describe as breathtaking, and Laura found simply overwhelming. She stood in the foyer, holding a single suitcase that contained everything she owned, feeling like an imposter in a museum. The master suite is there, Alexander said, gesturing down a hallway. Your room is here. He opened a door to reveal a space larger than her old apartment, complete with its own bathroom and a view that made her throat tighten. This is temporary, she said, more to herself than to him. Of course. But something in his tone suggested they both knew that temporary had a way of becoming permanent when enough money was involved. The transformation began immediately. Within hours, the apartment filled with people whose entire existence revolved around creating illusions. A stylist named Marcus who spoke about Laura's wardrobe as if it were a military operation. A woman named Catherine who taught her to walk differently, speak differently, smile on command. An etiquette coach who explained the difference between a charity luncheon and a board dinner with the precision of a surgeon. You're not playing Laura Bennett anymore, Catherine explained as they practiced conversation in the living room. You're playing someone who fell in love with Alexander Carlyle. Someone sophisticated enough to belong in his world, but not so polished that the love story becomes unbelievable. Laura learned to modulate her laugh, to touch Alexander's arm with casual intimacy, to deflect personal questions with graceful non-answers. It was method acting taken to an extreme that would have impressed any director. The story they crafted was simple enough to be believable. Laura was a freelance journalist who'd interviewed Alexander for a piece about international humanitarian efforts. They'd met again at a mutual friend's dinner party. The attraction had been immediate and mutual. They'd been quietly dating for 6 months before deciding to marry. The key, Alexander explained during one of their practice sessions, is to let people discover the romance rather than announcing it. Wealth makes people cynical about love stories. They need to feel like they're seeing something private. The first test came sooner than expected. 24 hours after signing the contract, Laura found herself in a black dress that cost more than her old monthly salary, standing beside Alexander at a charity gala for children's hospitals. 200 of Manhattan's most influential people moved through the Metropolitan Museum's Egyptian wing, wine glasses catching the light from ancient artifacts. "Remember," Alexander murmured as they approached a group of older women, "you're slightly nervous about meeting my friends. You want to make a good impression." Laura let her hand find his arm, noting how solid he felt beneath the expensive fabric. "Mrs. Worthington," Alexander said warmly, "I'd like you to meet Laura." The women descended like elegant vultures, their smiles sharp with curiosity. Laura had prepared for this, the subtle questions designed to map her background, her suitability, her intentions. She deflected with humor and self-deprecation, playing the role of someone genuinely charmed by Alexander's world, but not overwhelmed by it. "How did you know he was the one?" asked Mrs. Worthington, a woman whose diamonds probably cost more than most people's houses. Laura looked up at Alexander, letting a moment of silence stretch between them before answering. "He made me laugh when I was trying very hard to be professional." It was close enough to truth. He had surprised her that first day in the cafe, that the response felt natural. Around them, she could see the group softening, buying into the narrative of unexpected romance. But it was later, when they were alone in the car heading home, that Laura felt the full weight of what she'd committed to. "You're a natural," Alexander said, loosening his tie. "I wasn't sure you'd be able to access that level of vulnerability." "It's not vulnerability. It's performance. Is there a difference?" Laura stared out the window at the city flowing past them in streams of light. "There has to be." Back in the apartment, they maintained their careful distance. Alexander disappeared into his study with a glass of scotch and what looked like several hours of work. Laura stood in her room, still wearing the black dress, trying to reconcile the woman who'd charmed Manhattan's elite with the one staring back at her from the mirror. Her phone buzzed, a text from David Marshall at the paper. "Heard you landed on your feet. Smart move." The news was traveling already. By tomorrow, her transformation from unemployed journalist to Duchess would be complete in the eyes of everyone who mattered. The lawsuit would quietly disappear, buried beneath the weight of Alexander's legal team. The eviction notice would become irrelevant. She'd won. So why did victory feel so much like disappearing? Through the thin wall separating their rooms, she could hear Alexander moving around. The soft sound of footsteps, the closing of drawers, the intimate sounds of someone preparing for sleep. For the first time in months, Laura Bennett was safe. But as she hung up the black dress and prepared for bed in silk pajamas that probably cost more than she used to make in a week, she wondered if safety was worth the price of becoming someone else entirely. Outside, Manhattan glittered with its usual indifference, holding its secrets close while the city's newest couple learned to live with the consequences of their carefully constructed lie. 3 weeks into their arrangement, Laura discovered that living with Alexander Carlyle was like sharing space with a ghost who paid excellent rent. He moved through the apartment with practiced quiet, coffee brewing at precisely 6 a.m., the soft click of his study door closing, the whisper of expensive shoes against hardwood floors as he left for meetings that seemed to span continents. Their public appearances had been flawless. 2 more charity events, a board dinner where she'd charmed investors with questions about their grandchildren, and a carefully orchestrated candid moment outside Lincoln Center that had appeared in 3 society magazines. The coverage was exactly what Alexander needed: elegant, understated, suggesting stability without screaming performance. But it was the private moments that had begun to unnerve her. "You don't have to hide in your room," Alexander said one evening, finding her reading in the kitchen rather than the living room. He'd returned from London that afternoon, looking tired in a way that expensive suits couldn't quite conceal. "I'm not hiding. I'm reading. In the kitchen." Laura closed her book, a biography of Martha Gellhorn that felt like a reminder of the journalist she used to be. "The living room feels like a stage set. I keep expecting cameras." Alexander poured himself scotch from a bottle that probably cost more than her old car. "It's your home now, Laura, at least for the duration of our arrangement." The word arrangement had become a careful euphemism they both used, a way of maintaining distance from what they were actually doing. But hearing it now, After 3 weeks of shared morning coffee and parallel evening routines, it felt increasingly hollow. "Tell me about Sebastian," she said suddenly. Alexander's hand stilled on his glass. "What about him? You mentioned family complications. Rivals. I assume he's one of them." "My cousin." Alexander's voice carried the particular weariness of old wounds. "He's been positioning himself as an alternative heir since my father died. The boards listen to him because he presents himself as more stable, more traditional. And your marriage changes that. It removes his primary argument against my fitness to lead." Alexander sat across from her at the kitchen island, and for the first time since they'd begun this charade, the conversation felt genuinely private. "Sebastian has been suggesting that my bachelor status indicates a lack of commitment to family values and institutional continuity." Laura studied his face, noting the tight lines around his eyes. "That's Victorian thinking. We're dealing with Victorian institutions. Some of these trusts and holdings date back centuries. The people who control them think in terms of dynasties and bloodlines. And what does Sebastian get if he wins? Control of approximately $4 billion in assets. The authority to make decisions that affect thousands of employees worldwide." Alexander took a careful sip of scotch, and the satisfaction of proving that he was always the better choice. The numbers were staggering, but it was the personal pain in Alexander's voice that caught Laura's attention. This wasn't just about money or power. It was about worth, about belonging, about a lifetime of being measured against someone else. "He's going to test me, isn't he?" "Almost certainly." "When?" "Soon. There's a family dinner next week. You'll meet him then." Laura felt a familiar tightening in her chest, the same sensation she'd experienced before every major investigation, when the stakes became clear and retreat was no longer possible. "What should I expect? Sebastian is charming, intelligent, and completely ruthless. He'll try to find cracks in our story, inconsistencies in our behavior. He'll push until something breaks. And if he succeeds..." Alexander was quiet for a long moment. "Then you collect your contract payment and go back to your life. And I lose everything I've spent 15 years building." The weight of responsibility settled on Laura's shoulders like a coat she hadn't asked for. She'd signed up to play a role, not to hold someone's entire future in her hands. "No pressure," she said, attempting lightness. "I wouldn't have chosen you if I didn't think you could handle the pressure." Their eyes met across the kitchen island, and Laura felt something shift in the space between them. Not attraction. She was too smart to mistake intensity for romance, but recognition. They were both people who'd learned to carry more weight than they should have to bear. "I should warn you," Alexander said, standing to rinse his glass. "Sebastian will probably try to speak with you privately. He'll present it as friendly curiosity about my new wife. But it won't be. No. It will be an interrogation designed to look like casual conversation." Laura watched him move around the kitchen with economical precision, noting how he automatically cleaned up after himself, how he seemed to take up as little space as possible even in his own home. "Why do you live like this?" "Like what?" "Like you're a guest in your own life." Alexander paused, dish towel in hand, and Laura saw something flicker across his features, surprise, perhaps, or recognition. "Habit," he said finally. "When you grow up knowing that everything you have could be taken away, you learn not to get too comfortable." It was the most honest thing he'd said to her since they'd begun this arrangement, and Laura felt an unexpected urge to comfort him. The feeling was dangerous. Empathy was a luxury they couldn't afford. "I should go to bed," she said, gathering her book. "Big day tomorrow." "Laura." She stopped at the kitchen doorway. "Thank you for all of this. I know it's not what you signed up for." The gratitude in his voice was worse than his distance had been. Distance was professional, manageable. Gratitude suggested that he saw her as more than just a hired actress, and that recognition threatened to make everything far more complicated than either of them could afford. "Good night, Alexander." In her room, Laura lay awake listening to the sounds of the city 40 floors below and the quieter sounds of Alexander moving through his evening routine. Somewhere in the darkness between their bedrooms, the careful boundaries they'd established were beginning to blur. and Laura was beginning to understand that the most dangerous part of their arrangement wasn't Sebastian Carlyle or board meetings or public scrutiny. It was the growing possibility that their performance might become something real. The Carlyle family dinner took place in a private dining room at the Union Club, where portraits of long-dead industrialists gazed down with a particular disapproval reserved for those who'd never earned their own fortunes. Laura arrived wearing a navy dress that Catherine had selected for its suggestion of understated breeding, her wedding ring catching the light from crystal chandeliers that had witnessed a century of similar performances. Sebastian Carlyle was waiting for them at the bar, and Laura understood immediately why Alexander had warned her. Tall like his cousin but broader, with silver threading through dark hair and the kind of smile that promised either charm or devastation depending on his mood. He moved toward them with the confidence of a man who'd never doubted his place in any room. Alexander. The embrace was brief, familial, and loaded with undercurrents that Laura couldn't quite decipher. And this must be the famous Laura. He took her hand, holding it perhaps a moment too long, while his eyes assessed her with the thoroughness of an appraiser evaluating art. Sebastian Carlyle. I've been looking forward to meeting the woman who finally captured my cousin's attention. The feeling is mutual, Laura replied, noting how he positioned himself between her and Alexander with casual authority. Alexander has told me so much about his family. Has he? How fascinating. I suspect there are still a few stories he's keeping to himself. The dinner proceeded with the careful choreography of high-stakes diplomacy. Sebastian regaled them with anecdotes about their childhood, painting Alexander as brilliant but impractical, dedicated but naive. Laura watched her husband. The words still felt strange in her mind, become increasingly tense as Sebastian's stories accumulated into a subtle character assassination. Do you remember, Sebastian said over the main course, when you tried to convince the board to divest from those mining operations in South America? Such idealism. It was the right decision, Alexander replied quietly. Morally, perhaps, but it cost us nearly $60 million in revenue. Sebastian turned to Laura with the kind of confiding smile that suggested shared secrets. Your husband has always been more concerned with being right than being practical. Laura felt the trap being set with practiced precision. She was expected to either defend Alexander and appear naive, or remain neutral and suggest distance in their marriage. I'm married an idealist, she said carefully. Some women want security. I wanted someone who wouldn't compromise his principles for convenience. It was exactly the right response, supportive without being defensive, suggesting depth without claiming expertise. Sebastian's smile didn't waver, but Laura caught the slight tightening around his eyes. How refreshing. Most women in your position are more concerned with the practical benefits of marriage. The comment landed like a precision strike. Laura felt heat rise in her cheeks, not from embarrassment, but from anger at being dismissed so elegantly. Beside her, Alexander's jaw tightened. Most women in my position don't exist, Laura replied, her voice carrying the particular edge she'd perfected during hostile interviews. I'm not most women, Sebastian. No, indeed. You're unique. Sebastian raised his wine glass in a toast that felt more like a challenge. To unique women and the men fortunate enough to marry them. The conversation moved to safer topics. Mutual acquaintances, upcoming social events, the tedious details of maintaining appearances in their rarefied world. But Laura could feel Sebastian's attention like a weight, cataloging every gesture, every word, every moment of connection or distance between her and Alexander. It was during coffee that Sebastian made his real move. Laura, would you join me on the terrace? I'd love to hear more about your work. Alexander started to object, but Laura placed a hand on his arm, a gesture that had become automatic after weeks of practice. Of course, I could use some air. The club's terrace overlooked the city, Manhattan spreading below them in its eternal grid of ambition and compromise. Sebastian offered her a cigarette, which she declined, then lit one for himself with the casual elegance of someone performing for an invisible audience. You're very good, he said without preamble. I'm sorry, the performance. The devoted wife, the woman swept off her feet by romance. It's quite convincing. Laura felt ice form in her stomach, but her expression remained neutral. I'm not sure what you mean. Sebastian smiled, and for the first time that evening, the expression reached his eyes. My dear girl, I've been watching Alexander manipulate situations since we were children. He's brilliant at identifying what people need and providing exactly that. Are you suggesting? I'm suggesting that my cousin is desperate enough to marry a woman he barely knows in order to secure his position. Sebastian took a long drag from his cigarette. The question is, what are you desperate enough to do? Laura thought of her empty apartment, the lawsuit, the career that had been circling the drain before Alexander appeared with his impossible proposition. Sebastian was right about desperation, but he was wrong about everything else. I fell in love with your cousin, she said simply. Everything else is secondary. Love. Sebastian laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. How wonderfully convenient that you fell in love with someone who could solve all your problems. And how convenient that you're trying to destroy someone who stands in the way of your inheritance. The words hung in the air between them like a challenge. Sebastian's smile faded, replaced by something colder and more honest. Alexander has always been weak when it comes to emotions. It makes him vulnerable, unreliable. The boards need leadership from someone who understands that sentiment is a luxury we can't afford. The way you understand it. Precisely. Laura looked out over the city, at the lights that represented millions of lives intersecting in patterns too complex for any one person to control. You're wrong about him. Am I? He's not weak. He's careful. There's a difference. Sebastian dropped his cigarette and crushed it beneath his shoe with more force than necessary. We'll see, won't we? Marriage has a way of revealing people's true priorities. When they returned inside, Alexander was standing by the window, his reflection ghost-like in the dark glass. He turned as they approached, and Laura saw something in his eyes that made her chest tighten. Not fear, but resignation, as if he'd already accepted defeat. Ready to go home? She asked, slipping her hand into his. His fingers closed around hers with surprising warmth. Always. In the car afterward, they rode in silence until Alexander finally spoke. What did he want? To prove that we're lying. Laura watched the city flow past their window. He knows, Alexander. Maybe not the details, but he knows this isn't real. And what did you tell him? That I love you. Alexander's hands stilled on the steering wheel. In the darkness of the car, Laura couldn't see his expression, but she felt the weight of words that were both completely true and utterly false. Did he believe you? Laura thought of Sebastian's smile, of the calculation behind his charm, of the way he'd tested every word she'd spoken. No, she said finally, but he can't prove it. Not yet. They completed the drive home in silence, both understanding that the performance had just become infinitely more complicated. Sebastian knew they were lying, which meant he would be watching, waiting for the moment when their careful facade cracked wide enough to destroy everything Alexander had built. As they entered their apartment, Laura realized that their greatest threat wasn't exposure. It was the growing possibility that the lies they were telling the world might become the truth they were telling each other. The photograph appeared in the society pages 3 days after the dinner with Sebastian. Laura stared at it over her morning coffee, noting how the camera had captured the exact moment she'd placed her hand on Alexander's arm, a gesture that looked tenderly protective rather than performative. We look convincing, she said as Alexander joined her in the kitchen, already dressed for another day of meetings that would take him across time zones. He glanced at the newspaper, and she caught something flicker across his features. Perhaps too convincing. Before Laura could ask what he meant, his phone rang. The conversation was brief, conducted in the clipped tones he used for business, but she saw his expression grow increasingly grim. What is it? She asked when he hung up. Sebastian has called for a formal review of my fitness to serve as trustee. Alexander's voice was carefully controlled. The board will convene next month to evaluate my leadership. Laura felt the ground shift beneath her feet. Can he do that? The trust documents allow for challenges when there are questions about stability or judgment. Alexander poured coffee with mechanical precision. He's been building a case for months. Our marriage was supposed to neutralize his arguments. But it hasn't. It's bought us time. Nothing more. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of intensified scrutiny. Every public appearance became a test. Every photograph analyzed for signs of authenticity or strain. Laura found herself studying couples on the street, trying to decode the subtle language of long-term intimacy that she and Alexander were failing to replicate. The problem wasn't their public performances. Those remained flawless. It was the growing awareness that they were living parallel lives that occasionally intersected for an audience. At charity events, they moved together like dancers following choreography. At home, they maintained their careful distance, retreating to separate spaces the moment the front door closed behind them. It was Catherine, their etiquette coach, who finally voiced what everyone was thinking. "You're performing beautifully," she said after a particularly successful gallery opening. "But you're performing like actors, not like a married couple." "What do you mean?" Laura asked, though she suspected she already knew. Married couples have shorthand. Inside jokes. Moments of genuine irritation with each other. You two are too polite, too careful. It reads as artificial to anyone paying attention. That night, Laura found Alexander in his study, surrounded by financial documents and legal briefs. He looked up as she entered, and she was struck by how tired he seemed, not just physically, but emotionally depleted in a way that expensive suits and perfect posture couldn't hide. "We need to talk," she said. Alexander set down his papers and gestured to the chair across from his desk. About the fact that we're failing." He was quiet for a long moment. "The performances have been perfect. I know. That's the problem." Laura leaned forward. "We're so busy being the perfect couple that we've forgotten to be human beings. People can sense the difference." "What are you suggesting?" "That we start acting like we actually know each other. Like we share a life instead of just sharing space." Alexander's laugh was hollow. "And how do we accomplish that without crossing lines that neither of us wants to cross?" It was a fair question. The physical boundaries they'd established were clear and non-negotiable. But there were other kinds of intimacy, emotional territory that they'd been carefully avoiding since the day they'd signed their contract. "We start telling the truth," Laura said finally. "Not about the marriage, but about ourselves. If we're going to convince people we're in love, we need to actually understand what we'd be in love with." "Laura, I know this isn't what you signed up for, but Sebastian is watching for cracks, and right now we have more cracks than foundation." Alexander was quiet for several minutes, his fingers drumming against his desk in a rhythm that suggested internal debate. Finally, he looked up at her with something that might have been resignation or relief. "What do you want to know?" "Everything. Start with why this matters so much to you. And don't give me the corporate answer about fiduciary responsibility. Tell me the real reason." Alexander rose from his desk and walked to the window, looking out at the city spread below them. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of old wounds. "My father built the trust to outlast individuals. He believed that institutions were more important than personalities, that the work we do, funding hospitals, supporting education, creating jobs, was too important to depend on any one person's whims." Alexander paused, but he also believed that leadership required sacrifice, personal sacrifice. "And you've been making those sacrifices your entire life." "I've been preparing for them." He turned back to her. "When my father died, I was 28. Too young, according to the board. Sebastian was older, more traditional. They gave me the position provisionally, with the understanding that I need to prove my stability over time. 15 years of proving yourself. 15 years of being measured against someone who was never required to prove anything." The bitterness in Alexander's voice was raw, unguarded. "Sebastian inherited his certainty. I inherited doubt." Laura felt something shift inside her chest. Not attraction, but recognition. She understood the weight of constantly having to justify your worth, the exhaustion of being perpetually on trial. "My turn," she said softly. Alexander returned to his chair, and for the first time since she'd known him, his attention felt genuinely focused on her rather than their situation. "I became a journalist because I thought truth was a sword," Laura said. "I thought if I could just expose enough corruption, reveal enough lies, I could actually change things. make them better. And instead I learned that truth is a luxury most people can't afford, including me. She met his eyes. I lost my job because I wrote a story that was completely accurate and completely unpublishable. Sometimes being right just makes you unemployable. The construction fraud piece. Laura was surprised he knew the details. You really did research me thoroughly. I needed to understand who I was asking to share this burden. The word burden hung between them, honest in a way that arrangement had never been. They were both carrying weight they hadn't chosen, both performing roles that required sacrificing parts of themselves. Alexander, Laura said carefully, what happens if we fail? If Sebastian wins? The trust gets restructured under his leadership. For billion-dollar shifts to someone who believes that profit is the only meaningful measure of success. Alexander's voice was steady, but Laura could see the pain in his eyes. And I spend the rest of my life knowing that my father's faith in me was misplaced. Laura understood then why he'd been willing to hire a wife rather than find one naturally. This wasn't about convenience or social expectations. It was about proving he was worth the faith someone had placed in him decades ago. We're not going to fail, she said, and for the first time, the words felt like a promise rather than a performance. How can you be sure? Laura stood and moved around the desk until she was close enough to see the flecks of gold in his dark eyes, close enough to understand that their careful distance was another kind of lie. Because now I know what I'm fighting for. When she leaned down and kissed him, it wasn't for any audience except themselves, a seal on an agreement that had nothing to do with contracts and everything to do with recognizing someone else's worth when they'd forgotten it themselves. The kiss lasted exactly long enough to change everything. Alexander pulled away first, his hands still resting on Laura's arms, as if he couldn't quite decide whether to draw her closer or step back entirely. The space between them crackled with the electricity of a line that had just been crossed without permission from either party. Laura. Her name came out as half warning, half question. I know. She could feel her heart hammering against her ribs, could see the same confusion reflected in his eyes. That wasn't supposed to happen. No, it wasn't. But neither of them moved away. Laura remained standing beside his chair, Alexander's hands warm through the thin fabric of her sleeves, both of them suspended in the moment between impulse and consequence. We should talk about, Alexander began. His phone rang, the sound sharp enough to shatter whatever spell had settled over them. Alexander glanced at the display, and his expression shifted immediately to something Laura was beginning to recognize as his crisis management face. I have to take this, he said, already reaching for the phone. It's Hong Kong. Laura stepped back, the practical world reasserting itself with uncomfortable clarity. Of course. She gestured vaguely toward the door. Laura, wait. She paused at the threshold while Alexander answered the call in Mandarin, his voice taking on the authoritative tone he used for international negotiations. When he covered the phone with his hand, his eyes found hers across the study. We'll finish this conversation, he said. It was both a promise and a threat. Laura spent the next hour pacing her room, trying to convince herself that the kiss had been strategic, another layer of performance designed to strengthen their facade. But the excuse felt hollow even to her. There had been no audience in Alexander's study, no cameras, no one to convince except themselves. She was still pacing when she heard his study door open, followed by the familiar sounds of Alexander moving through his evening routine. For 20 minutes, she listened to him in the kitchen, the quiet efficiency of someone accustomed to solitude. Then silence. It was past midnight when she found him on the terrace, a glass of scotch in his hand and his jacket draped over the back of a chair. The city spread out below them like a circuit board, all lights and intersecting patterns of movement. Hong Kong, she asked, stepping outside. Crisis averted. For now. Alexander didn't look at her, but his posture shifted slightly to accommodate her presence beside him at the railing. There's always another crisis. Is that what we are? Another crisis to be managed? Now he did look at her, and Laura saw something in his expression that made her breath catch. Not the careful control he usually maintained, but something rawer, more uncertain. I don't know, he said finally. I thought I did, but... But when you kissed me, it didn't feel like crisis management. Laura wrapped her arms around herself against the night air. What did it feel like? Alexander was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of someone admitting a dangerous truth. Like coming home, the words hung in the air between them, honest and terrifying in equal measure. Laura felt something shift in her chest, a recognition that had nothing to do with their contract and everything to do with the man standing beside her, sharing his doubts and scotch and the vulnerability that came from being seen clearly. Alexander, she said carefully, what are we doing? I thought we were saving my inheritance and your career. That's what we were doing. What are we doing now? He turned to face her fully, and in the dim light from the apartment behind them, Laura could see the exact moment when his careful composure cracked. Now I think we're in trouble. Before Laura could respond, he was kissing her again, not the tentative exploration from his study, but with the intensity of someone who'd stopped pretending he didn't want exactly this. Laura's hands found the front of his shirt, pulling him closer as his fingers tangled in her hair, both of them surrendering to a need that had been building for weeks beneath their careful performances. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, Laura felt the world tilt on its axis. We can't, she whispered, even as her hands remained pressed against his chest. I know. The contract specifically states. I know. And Sebastian is watching for any sign of weakness. Laura. Alexander's hands framed her face, his thumbs brushing across her cheekbones. I know all the reasons this is impossible. I've been listing them for weeks. Then why? Because somewhere between watching you charm board members and listening to you defend me to my own family, I forgot that this was supposed to be pretend. Laura closed her eyes, trying to summon the practical voice that had guided her through 15 years of journalism, that had taught her to separate facts from feelings. Instead, all she could hear was her own heartbeat and the sound of Alexander breathing. This changes everything, she said. Yes. We could lose everything. Yes. Laura opened her eyes and found Alexander watching her with an expression of such careful hope that her chest ached. And you're willing to risk that? For the first time in my life, I think I might be willing to risk everything. It should have been a romantic declaration, but Laura heard the fear beneath it. Fear of a man who'd spent his entire adult life playing it safe, who understood that wanting something was the fastest way to lose it. What if this is just proximity? She asked. What if we're confusing performance with reality? Then we'll figure that out together. And Sebastian? We'll continue to be Sebastian regardless of what happens between us. Laura laughed despite herself. That's not exactly reassuring. I'm not offering reassurance. I'm offering... Alexander paused, searching for words. I'm offering truth. For the first time since this started, I'm offering something real. Laura looked out over the city, at the millions of people navigating their own complicated lives, making their own impossible choices. When she looked back at Alexander, she saw not the controlled businessman who'd hired her, but someone who'd forgotten how to want things for himself. Okay, she said finally. Okay, we're in trouble. Okay, this changes everything. Okay, we figure out together. Alexander's smile was different from any she'd seen before. Not the practice charm he used in public, but something genuine and slightly amazed, as if he couldn't quite believe what he was hearing. Together, he repeated, as if testing the word. Together. When he kissed her this time, it was with the reverence of someone sealing a covenant rather than signing a contract. And as Manhattan glittered below them, Laura Bennett and Alexander Carlyle crossed the final line between performance and reality, between safety and the terrifying possibility of love. They had no way of knowing that Sebastian Carlyle was already planning his next move, or that their newfound honesty would be tested in ways that would make their original arrangement seem simple by comparison. All they knew was that for the first time since their story began, they were writing it together. Laura woke the next morning to find Alexander's side of the bed empty and cold, the indentation in the pillow the only evidence that the previous night hadn't been an elaborate dream. For a moment, she lay still, cataloging the unfamiliar sensation of silk sheets against her skin and the distant sounds of morning traffic 40 floors below. They had crossed every line they'd established, shattered every boundary their contract had so carefully erected. And now, in the harsh light of morning, Laura felt the full weight of what that meant. The smell of coffee drew her to the kitchen, where she found Alexander at the island with his laptop and phone, already dressed in another perfectly tailored suit. He looked up as she entered, wearing one of his shirts over her pajama shorts, and something shifted in his expression. "Good morning," he said, his voice carrying a careful neutrality that made Laura's stomach drop. "Are we pretending last night didn't happen?" Alexander closed his laptop with deliberate precision. "We're acknowledging that last night happened and deciding what to do about it. That's very diplomatic. I'm feeling the need for diplomacy this morning." Laura poured herself coffee, noting how Alexander tracked her movement around the kitchen. The air between them hummed with unresolved tension, with the memory of his hands in her hair and her name on his lips. "Regrets?" she asked. "Questions? Such as?" Alexander stood, moving to the window that offered their magnificent view of Central Park. "Such as whether we've just given Sebastian everything he needs to destroy us." Laura felt cold despite the warmth of the coffee mug in her hands. Ow! Emotional compromise, loss of objectivity, the exact vulnerabilities he's been waiting for us to develop. Alexander's reflection in the window looked tired, older somehow. When people have something to lose, they make mistakes. Is that what I am? Something to lose? Alexander turned from the window, and Laura saw something raw and unguarded in his expression before he could mask it. "You're everything to lose." The admission hung between them like a confession. Laura set down her coffee, her hands not quite steady. "Alexander." His phone rang, cutting through whatever she'd been about to say. Alexander glanced at the display, and his expression hardened. "Sebastian," he said by way of explanation, then answered. "Good morning, cousin." Laura could hear Sebastian's voice through the phone, warm and friendly in a way that made her skin crawl. Alexander's responses were equally pleasant, equally false, a verbal fencing match disguised as family conversation. "Of course," Alexander said finally. "Saturday evening works perfectly. We'll see you then." When he hung up, his expression was grim. "What was that about?" "Sebastian is hosting a dinner party. A small gathering," he said. "Very intimate." Alexander's tone suggested that intimate was the last thing it would be. "He specifically requested that you attend. This is the test. This is the war." The next 3 days passed in a blur of preparation that felt more like training for battle than for a dinner party. Catherine returned to coach them through scenarios, drilling them on their story until the details felt as real as memory. Marcus selected Laura's outfit with the precision of someone choosing armor. Alexander's lawyer briefed them on what Sebastian might legally attempt, what boundaries existed, and how they might be tested. "Remember," Catherine said during their final session, "you're not just performing your marriage anymore. You're performing your marriage under attack. Sebastian will be watching for how you respond to pressure, how you protect each other, how you handle stress. And if we fail," Laura asked, "then Sebastian has ammunition for his case that Alexander lacks the judgment necessary for leadership." Saturday evening arrived with unseasonable warmth, and Laura's nerves stretched to the breaking point. Alexander's apartment filled with a familiar team of stylists and coaches, all moving with the efficiency of a military operation. "You look perfect," Alexander said as Laura emerged from her room, wearing a black dress that managed to suggest both sophistication and accessibility. "I feel like I'm about to walk into enemy territory." "You are." Alexander adjusted his tie with hands that weren't quite steady. "But you're not walking in alone." The dinner was held at Sebastian's townhouse on the Upper East Side, a monument to old money that whispered rather than shouted its wealth. Sebastian greeted them at the door with warmth that felt like a blade wrapped in silk. "Alexander, Laura, so wonderful to see you both." The other guests were familiar faces from their previous public appearances, board members, major donors, influential families whose opinions carried weight in the rarefied world Alexander inhabited. Laura recognized the setup immediately. An audience of people whose good opinion mattered, who would witness whatever Sebastian had planned. "Laura, you simply must meet Miranda Westfield," Sebastian said, guiding her away from Alexander with practiced ease. She's been so eager to hear about your work. Laura found herself separated from Alexander within minutes, drawn into conversations that felt like interviews disguised as small talk. Every question probed a different aspect of their relationship, their history, their future plans. She answered with the smooth confidence they'd practiced, but she could feel the weight of observation, the sense that every word was being cataloged for future use. It was during the third course that Sebastian made his move. "I have an announcement," he said, rising from his seat at the head of the table. "A toast, actually, to love and marriage and the bonds that tie us together." Laura felt Alexander tense beside her, his hand finding hers beneath the table. "As many of you know," Sebastian continued, "the Carlyle family has always believed in the importance of institutional stability, of making decisions based on long-term vision rather than short-term emotion." The room had gone very quiet, the kind of silence that preceded either celebration or execution, which is why I'm so delighted to share some wonderful news about our family's future. Sebastian's smile was brilliant, predatory. Laura felt ice form in her stomach. "Alexander and Laura, I know this might come as a surprise, but I've taken the liberty of sharing your happy news with everyone here." Alexander's hand tightened on hers. "Sebastian, the pregnancy, of course. Such wonderful timing, really. Nothing demonstrates commitment to family values quite like expanding the family." The words hit Laura like a physical blow. Around the table, faces turned toward them with expressions ranging from delight to calculation. Alexander had gone completely still beside her. "I'm afraid there's been a misunderstanding," Laura began, but Sebastian was already continuing. "Oh, don't be modest, dear. It's nothing to be embarrassed about. These things happen when two people are truly in love." Laura realized with crystalline clarity that Sebastian had just destroyed them. If she denied the pregnancy, she looked like she was hiding something. If she confirmed it, they were trapped in an ever-expanding web of lies. And if the truth came out that there was no pregnancy because there was no real marriage, everything they'd built would collapse. She looked at Alexander and saw her own understanding reflected in his eyes. Sebastian had cornered them perfectly, publicly, in front of witnesses whose opinions would determine Alexander's future. It was the kind of trap that could only be escaped by walking deeper into it. Laura stood slowly, aware that every eye in the room was on her, aware that the next words out of her mouth would either save them or destroy them completely. "You're absolutely right, Sebastian," she said, her voice carrying across the suddenly silent room. "There is wonderful news to share." She felt Alexander's shock like a physical force, but she didn't look at him. Instead, she smiled at the assembled guests with the radiance of a woman who'd just had her deepest secret revealed. "Alexander and I are expecting our first child." The room erupted in congratulations, glasses raised in toasts, voices overlapping in expressions of joy and excitement. But all Laura could hear was the sound of their carefully constructed world reshaping itself around a lie that would either bind them together or tear them apart. When she finally met Alexander's eyes across the chaos of celebration, she saw something that looked like admiration mixed with terror. They had survived Sebastian's trap by diving headfirst into a deeper one, and now they would have to find a way to live with the consequences. The car ride home passed in absolute silence. Laura stared out the window of Manhattan's late-night landscape, while Alexander gripped the steering wheel with white knuckles, both of them processing the magnitude of what had just occurred. Every few blocks, one of them would start to speak, then stop, as if words were too dangerous to risk in the confined space. It wasn't until they were in the elevator, rising toward their apartment 40 floors above the consequences of their evening, that Alexander finally broke. "What the hell did you just do?" Laura felt the question like a slap. "I saved us. You've destroyed us. Do you have any idea what you've just committed us to?" The elevator doors opened, and they moved through their apartment like strangers, the familiar space suddenly feeling foreign and hostile. Laura kicked off her heels and turned to face Alexander, who was pacing the living room with the energy of a caged animal. "Sebastian had us cornered," she said, fighting to keep her voice level. If you denied it, we'd have been embarrassed. Now we're trapped in a lie that has an expiration date. Alexander loosened his tie with sharp, angry movements. What happens in 9 months when there's no baby, Laura? What happens when Sebastian demands proof? Medical records? A birth certificate? We'll figure it out. We'll figure it out? Alexander's laugh was harsh, bitter. This isn't a story you can edit or a source you can protect. This is biology. This is time. This is us surviving the evening. Laura cut him off, her own anger finally surfacing. You wanted me to play the devoted wife? Fine. The devoted wife protects her husband when his cousin tries to destroy him in public. By fabricating a pregnancy? By buying us time to figure out how to actually destroy Sebastian before he destroys us. Alexander stopped pacing, his attention finally focusing on her with laser intensity. What do you mean? Laura moved to the bar cart, pouring herself vodka with hands that shook only slightly. I mean, Sebastian Carlyle just made a critical error. He showed his hand in front of witnesses. Everyone in that room now knows he's actively working to undermine you. They also think you're pregnant with my child. Yes, they do. Laura took a careful sip of vodka, using the burn to steady her nerves. Which gives us approximately 6 months to find a way to make Sebastian irrelevant before anyone expects to see actual evidence of a baby. Alexander sank into the leather chair by the window, his head in his hands. You're talking about destroying a man who's spent his entire life preparing for this moment. I'm talking about survival. Sebastian isn't going to stop, Alexander. Tonight was just the opening move. He's going to keep pushing until one of us breaks, and when we do, he'll be there to collect the pieces. So we break him first. Laura nodded. We break him first. They sat in silence for several minutes, the weight of their new reality settling around them like fog. Outside, Manhattan continued its eternal dance of ambition and compromise, indifferent to the private wars being fought in apartments high above the streets. How? Alexander asked finally. The same way I used to break corrupt politicians and crooked businessmen. We find the truth Sebastian doesn't want revealed, and we use it. Laura, this is my family we're talking about. No, this is your cousin who's trying to steal your birthright. Laura set down her glass and moved to stand in front of Alexander's chair. Tell me about Sebastian's business dealings, his personal life, his vulnerabilities. Alexander looked up at her, and Laura saw the moment when the grieving family member was replaced by the strategic businessman. Sebastian has always been careful, probably too careful. What do you mean? He's never taken risks, never made bold moves. He's built his reputation on being the safe choice, the conservative alternative to my supposedly reckless leadership. That's not a vulnerability, that's a strength. Unless it isn't. Alexander stood, moving to his study. Wait here. Laura heard him opening file cabinets, the rustle of papers being shifted and sorted. When he returned, he carried a manila folder thick with documents. Sebastian's investment history for the past 5 years, Alexander said, spreading papers across the coffee table. I've had my people tracking his moves, trying to anticipate his strategy. Laura scanned the documents, her journalist's eye automatically cataloging patterns and anomalies. These are all safe investments. Blue-chip stocks, government bonds, established real estate. Exactly. Nothing risky, nothing innovative, nothing that could be seen as speculative. Alexander, I'm not seeing. Laura stopped, her attention caught by a series of transactions from 18 months earlier. Wait, what's this? Alexander leaned over her shoulder to look at the document she was indicating. Cryptocurrency investments. About $2 million in Bitcoin and Ethereum. That's not exactly conservative. No, it isn't. And it was right before the major crash last year. Laura felt the familiar thrill of a story taking shape, the pieces clicking together in her mind. How much did he lose? Alexander pulled out another document, running his finger down a column of figures. Approximately $1.7 million. Nearly everything he invested. And this was reported to the Trust's investment committee. It should have been. All significant investments by board members are supposed to be disclosed for transparency purposes. Laura was already reaching for a laptop, her fingers flying across the keyboard as she accessed financial databases and regulatory filings. Alexander, if Sebastian failed to disclose speculative investments that lost the trust money, that's not just poor judgment, it's a violation of his fiduciary duty. You think you can prove it? I think I can do better than that. Laura's screen filled with trading records, disclosure forms, board meeting minutes. I think I can prove he's been lying about it for over a year. They worked through the night. Laura's investigative skills and Alexander's intimate knowledge of trust procedures combining to paint a picture of systematic deception. Sebastian hadn't just failed to disclose risky investments. He'd actively concealed them, burying the losses in complex financial structures designed to hide their true nature. By dawn, they had enough evidence to destroy Sebastian's reputation and his credibility with the board. The man who'd positioned himself as the safe, conservative alternative to Alexander had been gambling with trust assets and lying about the results. "This is it," Laura said, leaning back in her chair as the sun painted Manhattan gold and orange. "This is what we need." Alexander stood by the window, still wearing his rumpled suit from the dinner party that felt like it had happened days ago, rather than hours. "If we release this, Sebastian is finished. Not just his challenge to my position, his entire career." "Yes, he's still family, Laura." Laura saw the conflict in Alexander's posture, the weight of a decision that would fundamentally change his relationship with the only family he had left. But she also saw Sebastian's predatory smile from the night before, heard his voice announcing her fictional pregnancy to a room full of witnesses. "Family doesn't try to destroy you in public," she said quietly. Alexander turned from the window, and Laura saw that he'd made his decision. "What do we need to do? We need to get this information to the right journalists. People with the credibility and reach to make it stick. And we need to do it before Sebastian realizes what we've found." Alexander nodded slowly. "And the pregnancy?" Laura felt a stab of something that might have been loss or relief. "We'll handle that when we have to. First, we end this war." As they prepared to destroy the man who tried to destroy them, Laura couldn't help but think that their fake pregnancy, the lie that might save them or damn them, was still the least complicated truth they were dealing with. Outside, Manhattan was waking up to another day of ambition and betrayal, and Laura Bennett and Alexander Carlisle were about to discover just how far they were willing to go to protect what they'd built together, even if neither of them was entirely sure what that was anymore. The story broke on a Tuesday morning, splashed across the front page of the Financial Tribune with the kind of headline that ended careers. Trust board member concealed millions in cryptocurrency losses. Laura read it over coffee while Alexander fielded the first of what would become dozens of phone calls, his voice carrying the careful neutrality of someone who'd just watched his primary rival self-destruct. "No comment on family matters," he said into the phone for the third time. "You'll need to speak with Sebastian directly about his investment decisions." Laura marveled at his restraint. They had orchestrated Sebastian's downfall with surgical precision, but Alexander's public response remained measured, almost reluctant. It was exactly the right tone, disappointment rather than triumph, more in sorrow than in anger. Sebastian's counterattack came within hours. Laura was in the middle of a phone interview with a source for her freelance work when Alexander's assistant called. Catherine's voice was tight with something that might have been panic. "Turn on Channel 7, she said without preamble. "Now." Laura found the remote and switched to the news station, her blood turning to ice as Sebastian's face filled the screen. He was standing outside the Trust's headquarters, looking like a man who'd been wronged rather than exposed. "Deeply disappointed by these personal attacks on my character," he was saying, his voice carrying the perfect note of injured dignity. "It's clear that my cousin is willing to destroy family relationships to protect his position." The reporter, a sharp-featured woman Laura recognized from a society beat, leaned forward with predatory interest. "You're suggesting that Alexander Carlisle orchestrated the release of these financial records?" "I'm suggesting that desperate people do desperate things. And my cousin has been quite desperate lately." Sebastian's smile was sad, regretful. The pressures of his recent marriage, the responsibilities of impending fatherhood, it's changed him, made him willing to cross lines he never would have crossed before. Laura felt the room tilt. Sebastian was using their fake pregnancy against them, suggesting that Alexander had become reckless and vindictive because of personal stress. It was brilliant and devastating in equal measure. Are you saying that Mr. Carlyle's judgment has been compromised by personal matters? I'm saying that when a man's priorities shift from institutional responsibility to protecting his immediate family, it raises questions about his fitness for leadership. The interview continued for another few minutes, Sebastian expertly deflecting questions about his undisclosed investments while painting Alexander as emotionally unstable. By the time it ended, Laura felt sick with the realization that they'd handed Sebastian exactly the narrative he needed. Alexander's phone started ringing before the segment even finished. Laura could hear the tension in his voice as he fielded calls from board members, colleagues, and journalists, all wanting his response to Sebastian's implications. "We need to fix this," Laura said when he finally hung up. "How?" Everything Sebastian said was technically true. "I did orchestrate the release of his financial records. I'm under personal stress, and I have been willing to cross lines I never crossed before." Alexander's admission hung in the air between them like an indictment. Laura saw the weight of their choices settling on his shoulders, the accumulating cost of every lie they'd told and every line they'd crossed. "This isn't over," she said. "Sebastian made a mistake. He's suggesting you're unfit because you're protecting your family. That's not weakness. That's exactly what the board wants to see in a leader. Unless the family you're protecting is fabricated." Laura felt the familiar chill of impending exposure. Their fake pregnancy was the foundation of Sebastian's attack, but it was also the lie most likely to be discovered. And when it was, "We need Marcus," she said suddenly. "Laura, we need a crisis management strategy. Professional help. This is bigger than we can handle alone." Marcus arrived within the hour, his usual composure cracked by the magnitude of what they were facing. He listened to their account of the previous 24 hours without interruption, his expression growing increasingly grim. "The pregnancy complicates everything," he said finally. "It makes this personal in a way that's very difficult to manage." "We know," Alexander said. "Do you?" "Because right now, Sebastian is painting you as a man whose judgment has been compromised by impending fatherhood. The board is going to want proof that you're still capable of objective decision-making." "What kind of proof?" Marcus was quiet for a long moment, and Laura saw something in his expression that made her stomach drop. "They're going to want to see you put institutional interests ahead of personal ones. They're going to want you to sacrifice something that matters to you for the good of the trust. Such as your wife." The words hit Laura like a physical blow. Alexander went very still beside her, his hand unconsciously moving to cover hers. "Explain," Alexander said, his voice dangerously quiet. "Sebastian has given them a narrative. Unstable man makes poor decisions to protect pregnant wife. The most effective way to counter that narrative is to demonstrate that you're willing to make difficult choices for institutional reasons, even if they hurt you personally." "You're talking about divorce," Laura said. "I'm talking about ending this marriage before it becomes a liability that destroys everything Alexander has worked for." Laura felt the room spinning around her. Somewhere in the space between their fake pregnancy and Sebastian's counterattack, she'd forgotten that their marriage was still a business arrangement with an expiration date. But now that date was approaching rapidly, measured not in months, but in the political necessities of corporate warfare. "And if I refuse?" Alexander asked. "Then Sebastian's strategy succeeds. The board sees you as compromised, emotional, unfit for leadership. You lose everything." Alexander stood abruptly, moving to the window that had become his sanctuary whenever their situation grew overwhelming. Laura watched his reflection in the glass, saw the moment when the man who'd kissed her on the terrace was replaced by the strategic businessman who'd hired her 6 months ago. "How long do we have?" "The board meets next week to discuss Sebastian's formal challenge. If you're going to act, it needs to be before then." Laura felt something inside her chest crack and splinter. She'd known this moment would come, had signed a contract that spelled out exactly these terms, but knowledge didn't make the reality any less devastating. "So we divorce," she said, her voice steadier than she'd expected. "We say the stress of Sebastian's attacks, and the public scrutiny were too much. That we realized we married too quickly, that we want different things. Marcus nodded approvingly. Exactly. Alexander chooses duty over personal happiness. The board sees him as someone willing to make hard choices for institutional good. And Laura gets painted as the gold-digging opportunist who couldn't handle the pressure, Alexander said, his voice tight with anger. Laura disappears. Marcus corrected. Clean break. No interviews, no statements. She becomes a footnote in your story rather than a chapter. Laura heard her own erasure being planned with clinical precision and felt something sharp and dangerous rise in her throat. She'd spent 6 months building a life that was half real and half performance, and now she was being asked to delete herself from the narrative entirely. No, she said quietly. Both men turned to look at her. No, she repeated more firmly this time. I won't be erased. I won't disappear quietly so that Alexander can prove his worthiness to a board of people who should be grateful to have him. Laura, Alexander began. No, Alexander. You hire me to play a role, and I've played it perfectly. But you don't get to rewrite the ending to make me the villain who walked away when things got difficult. Marcus cleared his throat. Mrs. Carlyle, with respect, the priority here has to be finding a third option. Laura stood, facing both men with the steel she'd learned during 15 years of investigative journalism. Because I'm not disappearing, and Alexander isn't sacrificing our marriage to prove his fitness for leadership. Then what do you suggest? Marcus asked. Laura looked at Alexander, saw the conflict in his eyes, the war between duty and desire that had been raging since the night they'd first kissed. I suggest we stop running from Sebastian and start fighting back. For real this time. What do you mean? I mean we turn this pregnancy into a weapon instead of a liability. We use it to show that Alexander Carlyle isn't just fit for leadership. He's the only leader who understands what's actually at stake. Alexander moved away from the window, his attention focused on her with laser intensity. Ow! Laura smiled, feeling the familiar thrill of a story taking shape, a strategy crystallizing from the chaos of their situation. We're going to make Sebastian's attack backfire so spectacularly that the board won't just confirm your leadership. They'll wonder why they ever doubted it. Outside, Manhattan hummed with the energy of millions of people fighting their own battles for survival and success. Inside their apartment, Laura Bennett and Alexander Carlyle prepared to wage war not just for his inheritance, but for the right to define their own story. Even if neither of them was entirely sure how it would end. Laura spent the night crafting what she privately called her nuclear option, a strategy so audacious it would either secure Alexander's position permanently or destroy them both in the most spectacular fashion possible. She worked in the study while Alexander slept fitfully in their bedroom, surrounded by financial records, media contacts, and the kind of meticulous planning that had once made her one of New York's most feared investigative journalists. By dawn, she had a plan that made her simultaneously exhilarated and terrified. Alexander found her at sunrise, still wearing the clothes from the previous day, empty coffee cups scattered around her like evidence of an all-night war council. Tell me, he said without preamble. Laura looked up from her laptop, noting the shadows under his eyes, the way his usually perfect posture had acquired a slight slump. The past week had aged him in ways that 6 months of their arrangement hadn't. We're going to give an exclusive interview, she said. Full transparency. The whole story. Alexander sat down heavily in the chair across from her. Laura, if we tell the truth about the marriage, not about the marriage, about Sebastian, about the trust, about what's really at stake here. Laura turned her laptop so he could see the screen, filled with research on the Carlyle Trust charitable work, its impact on communities, the thousands of jobs and lives that depended on its continued stability. We're going to reframe this entire narrative. Ow! By making it about more than just family politics. By showing people what happens when institutional leadership gets decided by personal vendettas instead of merit. Alexander scanned the documents she'd compiled, his expression growing increasingly intrigued. You want to make this a public referendum on Sebastian's fitness. I want to make this a story about what kind of leadership the world needs right now. And then I want to demonstrate that you're the only person in this equation who actually embodies that leadership. Laura pulled up another document, a comprehensive analysis of every major decision Alexander had made as a trustee, contrasted with Sebastian's more conservative, profit-focused approach. "Look at this," she said, pointing to a comparison chart. "Your environmental initiatives, your education programs, your commitment to sustainable development. Sebastian talks about fiscal responsibility, but you've actually grown the trust assets while making them work for social good. Sebastian will argue that I've taken unnecessary risks. Let him, because when people see the results, the schools built, the communities revitalized, the innovations funded, they'll understand that some risks are worth taking." Alexander was quiet for several minutes, studying the materials she'd assembled. Laura could see him running through scenarios, calculating possibilities and probabilities with the precision that had made him successful in international business. "Who would conduct this interview?" "Sandra Morrison at 60 Minutes. I've already reached out through back channels. She's interested." Alexander's eyebrows rose. "That's not exactly a friendly venue." "Exactly. Sebastian won't be able to dismiss it as puff pieces or PR manipulation. Morrison has a reputation for asking hard questions, including questions about our marriage, about the pregnancy." Laura felt her stomach tighten, but she'd spent the night preparing for this moment. "Yes, she'll ask those questions. And we'll answer them how, exactly?" Laura took a deep breath, knowing that what she was about to propose would change everything between them again. "We'll answer them honestly." Alexander went very still. "Laura, not about the contract, not about the arrangement, but honestly about what this marriage has become, about what we mean to each other, about why we're fighting so hard to protect it." The silence stretched between them, loaded with 6 months of careful lies and growing truths, with contracts signed in desperation and kisses shared in hope. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that somewhere between performing love and living together, between facing Sebastian's attacks and planning our future, this stopped being fake for me." Laura's voice was steady despite the magnitude of what she was admitting. "I'm saying that when we tell Sandra Morrison that we love each other, that we're committed to building a life together, that we're excited about starting a family, it won't be a lie." Alexander stood abruptly, beginning the pacing that had become his signature response to emotional overwhelm. "Laura, you can't just decide. I'm not deciding anything for you. I'm telling you what's true for me. What you do with that information is entirely your choice. And if I can't say the same thing..." Laura felt her heart contract, but she met his eyes steadily. "Then we'll figure out a different strategy. But Alexander, if we're going to sell the world on our marriage, we need to believe in it ourselves. Really believe in it." Alexander stopped pacing, his attention fixed on her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "You're asking me to risk everything, my position, my family legacy, my future, on the possibility that what's between us is real. I'm asking you to risk everything on the certainty that what's between us is worth fighting for." The distinction mattered, and they both knew it. Laura was no longer talking about saving his inheritance or preserving her career. She was talking about choosing love over safety, truth over strategy, the terrifying possibility of happiness over the comfortable certainty of their arrangement. "The pregnancy," Alexander said finally. "We'll handle it when we have to. But for now, it's part of our story, part of what we're fighting to protect." Alexander moved to the window, looking out at Manhattan as it stirred to life far below them. Laura watched his reflection, saw the moment when the strategic businessman began to give way to the man who'd kissed her on the terrace, who'd held her through the night, who'd forgotten that their love was supposed to be pretend. "If we do this," he said without turning around, "there's no going back. No exit strategy, no clean ending when the board confirms my position. I know, you'd be signing up for a lifetime of this world. The scrutiny, the expectations, the constant performance. I'd be signing up for a lifetime with you." Alexander turned from the window, and Laura saw something in his expression that made her heart race. Not fear, but something that looked remarkably like hope. "You're sure?" "I'm terrified. But yes, I'm sure." Alexander crossed the room in 3 strides, pulling her into his arms with an urgency that spoke to 6 months of careful distance and growing need. When he kissed her, Laura tasted desperation and commitment in equal measure. "Then let's call Sandra Morrison," he said against her lips. "Let's tell the world who we really are." As they prepared to stake everything on love and honesty, neither Laura nor Alexander knew that Sebastian Carlyle had spent his own sleepless night planning a final gambit, one that would test not just their commitment to each other, but their ability to survive the kind of public destruction that left no survivors. The war for the Carlyle inheritance was about to become very personal indeed. The 60 Minutes crew arrived at their apartment on a gray Friday afternoon, transforming their carefully curated living space into a television set with surgical efficiency. Sandra Morrison, impeccably dressed and sharp-eyed, directed the placement of cameras and lighting with the authority of someone who'd spent 30 years making powerful people uncomfortable on national television. Laura watched from the kitchen as Alexander conferred with the sound technician, noting how he'd unconsciously adopted the posture he used for high-stakes business negotiations. Shoulders back, expression neutral, every gesture calculated for maximum authority. In 3 hours, that control would be tested in ways that corporate boardrooms had never prepared him for. "Mrs. Carlyle?" Sandra Morrison appeared beside her, coffee cup in hand and the smile of a predator who preferred her prey relaxed. "I wanted to thank you for agreeing to this. It's rare to get such unprecedented access to a story like this." "Alexander believes in transparency," Laura replied carefully. "And you? Do you believe in transparency?" Laura met Morrison's steady gaze, recognizing the first of what would be many probing questions. "I believe in truth, even when it's complicated." Morrison's smile sharpened slightly. "Oh, it's always complicated. That's what makes it interesting." The interview began at 7 o'clock, with Alexander and Laura positioned on their living room sofa, the Manhattan skyline providing a backdrop that suggested both power and vulnerability. Morrison sat across from them, her notes arranged with military precision, her manner deceptively conversational. "Let's start with the obvious question," Morrison said as the cameras rolled. "Sebastian Carlyle has suggested that your marriage has compromised your judgment as a trustee. How do you respond to that?" Alexander's answer was smooth, practiced. "Sebastian is entitled to his opinion, but I believe the record speaks for itself. Under my leadership, the trust has expanded its charitable reach while growing its assets by 18%. But he's not questioning your business acumen. He's questioning whether personal considerations, specifically your wife's pregnancy, have made you prone to emotional decision-making." Laura felt Alexander's slight tension, the almost imperceptible pause that preceded his response. "My personal life strengthens my professional judgment. Understanding what's at stake for future generations gives me perspective on long-term decision-making that pure business considerations can't provide." Morrison turned her attention to Laura. "Mrs. Carlyle, you're a journalist by training. Surely you understand the perception problem here. A woman with no trust experience suddenly married to one of the city's most eligible bachelors, now pregnant within months of the wedding. It raises questions about motives." The question was a scalpel, precise and designed to cut. Laura had prepared for it, but preparation and execution were different things entirely. "I understand why people might be skeptical," Laura said carefully. "But my experience as a journalist taught me to look beyond surface appearances. Alexander isn't just an eligible bachelor. He's someone who's dedicated his life to using wealth responsibly. That's not something you can fake or perform. It's who he is." "And the pregnancy?" "The timing seems remarkably convenient for someone whose leadership is being challenged on grounds of stability." Laura felt the trap closing around them, the moment when their carefully constructed narrative would either hold or crumble entirely. Beside her, Alexander's hand found hers, and she drew strength from the contact. "The pregnancy wasn't planned," she said, allowing vulnerability to enter her voice. "But it's not inconvenient either. It's a reminder that leadership isn't just about managing assets. It's about building something that lasts beyond your own lifetime." Morrison leaned forward slightly, sensing weakness. "Some might say that unplanned pregnancies are evidence of impulsive decision-making. Poor planning. The kind of judgment lapses that raise concerns about someone managing billions of dollars. The silence in the room was deafening. Laura felt the weight of cameras, of Alexander's tension, of their entire future balanced on her next words. Some people might say that, she agreed quietly. But those people would be missing the point entirely. Which is that life doesn't follow business plans. The most important decisions, the ones that actually matter, can't be scheduled or strategized. Sometimes you have to trust your instincts and deal with the consequences. Morrison's eyes glittered with professional satisfaction. Is that what happened with your marriage? Trusting instincts over careful planning. Laura looked at Alexander, seeing in his eyes the same recognition she felt, that they had reached the moment of truth, the place where performance ended and reality began. Yes, Laura said simply. We trusted our instincts, and they led us to each other. Rather quickly, though. 6 months from meeting to marriage to pregnancy. Even for impulsive people, that's an accelerated timeline. Alexander spoke for the first time in several minutes, his voice carrying a weight that came from someone choosing honesty over strategy. Sandra, with respect, you're asking the wrong questions. Morrison's eyebrows rose. Am I? You're asking about timing and perceptions and political implications. But the real question is simpler. Does my marriage make me a better leader or a worse one? And the answer is unequivocally better. How so? Because for the first time in my adult life, I have something to fight for beyond obligation, beyond duty to my father's memory or the expectations of the board. Laura and our child give me a future worth building, not just a legacy worth preserving. Laura felt something shift in her chest, a recognition that Alexander's words carried the ring of absolute truth. This wasn't performance or strategy. This was the man she'd fallen in love with, speaking from a place of complete honesty. Morrison, veteran interviewer that she was, recognized the moment as well. And what about you, Mrs. Carlyle? What do you say to people who suggest you married into wealth and convenience? I'd say they don't understand what they're talking about, Laura replied, her voice steady and clear. I'm married someone who challenges me, who makes me want to be better than I am, who sees the world as something that can be improved rather than just managed. If that comes with wealth and social position, fine. But that's not why I'm here. Why are you here? Laura looked at Alexander, at the man who'd hired her to play a role and ended up giving her a reason to stop pretending entirely. Because I love him. Because what we're building together matters more than what either of us could accomplish alone. And because sometimes the most radical thing you can do is tell the truth about what you want. Morrison continued the interview for another 30 minutes, but Laura knew that moment had been the turning point. Not just for the story, but for their marriage, their future, their understanding of what they meant to each other. When the crew finally packed up their equipment and left, the apartment felt strangely empty, charged with the electricity of public confessions and private truths. How do you think it went? Alexander asked as they stood in their living room, suddenly alone with the magnitude of what they'd just done. I think we just declared war on everyone who underestimated us, Laura replied. Including ourselves? Laura smiled, feeling lighter than she had in months. Especially ourselves. The interview would air the following Sunday, giving Sebastian exactly enough time to prepare his response, and giving Laura and Alexander exactly enough time to discover whether love was sufficient ammunition for the battle they'd just escalated beyond any possibility of retreat. Outside, Manhattan glittered with the dreams and ambitions of 8 million people, most of whom would never know that 40 floors above the street, 2 people had just chosen truth over safety and discovered that some risks were worth everything. The real test would come when the world responded. But for the first time since their story began, Laura and Alexander would be fighting it together, as partners, as allies, and as 2 people who discovered that the best lies were often just truth waiting for permission to be spoken. The interview was scheduled for the following Friday. They had exactly 1 week to prepare for the most important performance of their lives, the one where they finally stopped performing entirely. The interview aired on a Sunday night in October, and by Monday morning, the world had changed. Laura woke to the sound of Alexander's phone ringing incessantly, joined by her own device chiming with notifications from social media news alerts, and text messages from numbers she didn't recognize. Jesus, Alexander muttered, scrolling through his emails while simultaneously fielding a call from his lawyer. Morrison wasn't kidding about unprecedented access. Laura checked her own phone and immediately regretted it. The interview clips were everywhere. Their declarations of love, her admission about the unplanned pregnancy, Alexander's passionate defense of their marriage. But it was the comments that made her stomach turn. Gold digger finally got caught. Convenient pregnancy is convenient. Poor bastard doesn't know what hit him. Actually seems genuine, though. Either great acting or real love. Can't tell which. The last comment made Laura pause. In the harsh light of public scrutiny, she wasn't entirely sure herself anymore, where performance ended and reality began. "We need to get dressed," Alexander said, ending his call. "Marcus wants us at the office by 10. Damage control." "Is it damage?" Alexander showed her his phone, displaying a CNN headline. Carlisle heir defends marriage in explosive interview. Below it, a subtitle read, "Trust board to meet emergency session following couple's public confessions." Sebastian called an emergency board meeting, Alexander said grimly. This afternoon, Laura felt ice form in her stomach. He's accelerating his timeline. He's striking while we're vulnerable. While the interview is fresh and people are questioning our credibility. They arrived at Alexander's office to find Marcus in full crisis mode, surrounded by laptops, newspapers, and the kind of frenetic energy that came from trying to control a story that had already escaped all boundaries. "The good news," Marcus said without preamble, "is that public reaction is more divided than Sebastian probably hoped. A lot of people found you both convincing, sympathetic even. And the bad news?" Laura asked. "The board isn't the general public. They're business people who care about institutional stability, not romantic narratives. And Sebastian is spinning this as evidence that Alexander has completely lost perspective." Marcus pulled up a statement on his laptop, Sebastian's official response to the interview, released 2 hours after it aired. "While I respect my cousin's right to personal happiness," Marcus read aloud. His public admissions raise serious questions about his judgment and fitness for leadership. "The trust cannot be governed by emotion, however sincere." "Bastard," Alexander muttered. "Effective bastard," Marcus corrected. "He's positioned himself as the rational alternative to your emotional leadership." The board meeting this afternoon will likely focus on competency rather than personal attacks. Laura studied the statement, her journalist's instincts picking up nuances that pure emotion might have missed. "He's scared," she said suddenly. Both men looked at her. "Sebastian's scared. Look at the language. He's not attacking our marriage directly anymore. He's trying to separate personal happiness from professional competence. That's defensive positioning." "Meaning what?" Alexander asked. "Meaning the interview worked. Maybe not the way we intended, but it worked. People are talking about love and commitment and building something meaningful. Sebastian's talking about institutional stability and emotional governance. Guess which message resonates more in 2024? Marcus was already pulling up social media metrics, news coverage analysis, public sentiment tracking. She's right. The negative coverage is focusing on timing and skepticism, but the positive coverage is talking about authenticity and partnership. You're winning the narrative war, even if you're losing the boardroom. Alexander moved to his office window, looking out at the city that had shaped his entire adult life. But the boardroom is what matters. The narrative war doesn't mean anything if Sebastian gets the votes he needs. Then we change the battlefield, Laura said. "What do you mean?" Laura was already reaching for her phone, her mind racing with possibilities that felt both desperate and brilliant. "We make this about more than just internal politics. We make it about what kind of leadership the world actually needs." "Laura, no, listen. Sebastian thinks he can win by making this about emotion versus rationality, personal versus institutional. But what if those aren't opposites? What if they're exactly what effective leadership requires?" She was dialing a number, her fingers moving with the certainty of someone who'd just seen the final move in a chess game that had been building for months. "Who are you calling?" "Dr. Jennifer Walsh. She runs the Global Leadership Institute at Columbia." I interviewed her 2 years ago about emotional intelligence in executive decision-making. The call connected, and Laura's voice shifted into the professional register she perfected during 15 years of journalism. Dr. Walsh, this is Laura Bennett. We spoke in 2022 about your research on leadership effectiveness. Yes, I saw your op-ed about the Carlisle situation. Actually, that's why I'm calling. Alexander and Marcus watched as Laura negotiated what appeared to be a complex arrangement. Her conversation peppered with references to research data, public interest, and media opportunities. Perfect, she said finally. We'll see you at 2. What did you just arrange? Alexander asked as she hung up. Dr. Walsh is going to present her research to your board meeting this afternoon. Research that demonstrates conclusively that leaders who integrate personal values with professional decisions consistently outperform those who compartmentalize them. Marcus looked skeptical. The board agreed to hear from an outside expert. They will when they understand that she has data on leadership effectiveness that directly applies to trust management. And when they realize that refusing to hear evidence would make them look like they're afraid of objective analysis. Alexander was staring at Laura with something that looked like amazement mixed with terror. You're turning an internal board meeting into an academic presentation. I'm turning Sebastian's attack on your emotional leadership into a referendum on what kind of leadership actually works in a modern world. Laura's phone buzzed with a text from Dr. Walsh. Board chair confirmed. See you at 2. This should be interesting. She's in, Laura announced. Now we just need to survive the next 4 hours. Alexander pulled Laura into his arms, holding her with an intensity that spoke to the magnitude of what she'd just orchestrated. You realize you've just bet our entire future on an academic theory about leadership effectiveness? I bet our future on the truth, that what we have together makes you a better leader, not a worse one. That love and competence aren't mutually exclusive, that the board will recognize good leadership when they see it, even if Sebastian can't. And if you're wrong, Laura looked into Alexander's eyes and saw her own certainty reflected there, not about the outcome, but about the choice they were making together. Then we'll have lost fighting for something worth fighting for. Outside, Manhattan hummed with the energy of millions of people making their own impossible choices, fighting their own battles for meaning and connection. Inside Alexander's office, Laura Bennett and Alexander Carlisle prepared for the final confrontation that would determine not just the future of a $4 billion trust, but the future of two people who discovered that the most convincing performances were sometimes just truth waiting for permission to be itself. The board meeting was scheduled for 3 o'clock. In 4 hours, they would learn whether love was sufficient ammunition for the war they'd been fighting since the day they'd signed a contract that no longer defined what they meant to each other. The reckoning had come at last. The Carlisle Trust boardroom had never hosted anything quite like Dr. Jennifer Walsh's presentation. As board members filed in at 3 o'clock sharp, they found themselves facing not just the expected family drama, but a Columbia professor armed with 2 decades of research data and the kind of quiet authority that came from studying power rather than simply wielding it. Sebastian arrived precisely on time, his expression perfectly calibrated to suggest reluctant duty rather than personal ambition. He nodded cordially to Alexander and Laura, the picture of a man more disappointed than angry at his cousin's poor judgment. I appreciate everyone's flexibility in accommodating this academic perspective, Sebastian said as he took his seat, though I'm not entirely sure how theoretical research applies to our specific situation. Dr. Walsh smiled with the patience of someone who'd spent her career dealing with skeptical executives. Mr. Carlisle, I think you'll find that effective leadership principles are remarkably consistent across contexts, including family trusts. Laura watched from the gallery as the boardroom transformed into an unlikely battlefield. Alexander sat at the head table with the bearing of someone who'd accepted that his entire future would be decided in the next hour. Sebastian maintained his posture of regretful concern, and Dr. Walsh began to systematically dismantle every assumption about leadership that Sebastian's challenge relied upon. The data is unambiguous, Dr. Walsh said, clicking through slides that showed correlation after correlation. Leaders who integrate personal values with professional decisions demonstrate superior long-term performance across every metric we can measure: innovation, risk management, stakeholder satisfaction, financial returns. Board member Harold Westbrook, a man who'd known Alexander since childhood, leaned forward. But surely there's a difference between having values and allowing personal circumstances to cloud judgment. There is indeed, Mr. Westbrook. The difference is self-awareness. Leaders who understand how their personal investments affect their professional choices make better decisions than those who pretend such investments don't exist. Dr. Walsh pulled up Alexander's track record, not just financial returns, but employee satisfaction, community impact, sustainable development metrics. Every category showed improvement since his marriage. Mr. Alexander Carlisle's performance as a trustee has demonstrably improved in the 8 months since his wedding. His decisions show greater consideration for long-term consequences, more innovative thinking, and enhanced stakeholder engagement. Sebastian shifted uncomfortably. With respect, Dr. Walsh, correlation isn't causation. You can't prove that marriage improved Alexander's judgment. You're absolutely right, Mr. Sebastian Carlyle. I can't prove causation, but I can demonstrate that your premise, that emotional investment compromises professional effectiveness, is contradicted by every serious leadership study conducted in the past 20 years. Laura felt the mood in the room shifting as Dr. Walsh continued her presentation. Board members who'd entered looking skeptical were now taking notes. Questions focused less on Alexander's fitness and more on the research methodology, the sample sizes, the implications for trust governance. When Dr. Walsh finished, Board Chair Margaret Reynolds called for a brief recess. Laura found Alexander in the hallway, his usual composure cracked by the weight of having his entire future dissected in public. "How do you think it went?" he asked. "I think Dr. Walsh just made Sebastian's argument look like a relic from 1950. And if the board doesn't care about academic research..." Laura took his hands, noting how they trembled slightly despite his outward calm. "Then we'll have shown them exactly who you are. Someone who fights for what matters, who brings his whole self to his work, who understands that leadership isn't about compartmentalizing your life, but about integrating it purposefully." When the board reconvened, Margaret Reynolds' expression was unreadable. "We've heard from Dr. Walsh about leadership theory. Now I think it's time we heard directly from the principals." Sebastian spoke first, his argument polished and familiar. Alexander lacked the emotional distance necessary for objective decision-making. Personal pressures had compromised his judgment. The trust required leadership that put institutional interests above family considerations. Then it was Alexander's turn. "My cousin is right about one thing," Alexander said, standing to address the board that had known him since he was a teenager. "I'm emotionally invested in this role. I'm invested in it because I understand for the first time in my adult life what we're actually building here." He gestured to the research Dr. Walsh had presented, but his eyes found Laura's across the room. "For 20 years, I've managed this trust as if it were an abstract financial instrument, something to be preserved and grown according to established principles. But marriage, becoming part of something larger than myself, has shown me that preservation isn't enough. We're responsible for building a foundation that future generations can use to create meaningful change." Alexander's voice grew stronger as he continued, the uncertainty of the past months giving way to absolute clarity about what mattered. "Sebastian offers you competent management, careful stewardship, the preservation of what my father built. But I'm offering you something different, the courage to build something better, to take the risks that create lasting impact rather than just sustainable returns." He paused, looking at each board member in turn. "The choice isn't between emotional leadership and rational leadership. It's between leadership that maintains the status quo and leadership that creates positive change. And that choice has never been more important than it is right now." The silence that followed stretched for nearly a minute. Finally, Margaret Reynolds spoke. "This board will deliberate privately and announce our decision within 24 hours. As the boardroom emptied, Laura felt the surreal calm that followed moments of absolute commitment. They'd said everything that could be said, revealed everything that could be revealed. The rest was beyond their control. Sebastian approached them in the hallway, his mask of cordial concern finally slipping to reveal something harder, more calculating. "You fought well," he said to Alexander. "I hope the victory is worth what it cost you." "What do you mean?" Sebastian's smile was sharp, predatory. "I mean that regardless of how the board votes, everyone now knows that your marriage began as a business arrangement, that your wife was hired to play a role, that your pregnancy might be as fictional as your love story." Laura felt the blood drain from her face. Sebastian knew, had perhaps always known. "The difference between us," Sebastian continued conversationally, "is that I would never have been foolish enough to fall in love with my own performance." With that, he walked away, leaving Alexander and Laura to contemplate the possibility that they had won the battle only to lose the war in ways they'd never anticipated. That night, they sat on their terrace overlooking Manhattan, not speaking, not touching, both lost in private calculations of victory and defeat. "He's going to expose us," Laura said finally. "Probably. The board will rescind their decision. Your reputation will be destroyed. My career will be over." "Probably." Laura looked at Alexander, seeing not fear in his expression, but something that looked remarkably like peace. "You don't seem concerned." Alexander turned from the city lights to look at her, and Laura saw in his eyes the same certainty she'd felt in the boardroom when he'd spoken about building something better. "Sebastian can expose our contract," Alexander said quietly. "He can reveal how this marriage began. He can destroy our public reputation and probably end my career." "Then why aren't you terrified?" Alexander reached for her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers with the familiarity of months of shared deception and growing truth. "Because he can't expose what this marriage became. He can't reveal that I fell in love with my wife, that she fell in love with me, that what started as performance became the most real thing in either of our lives." Laura felt tears she hadn't expected, relief and fear mixing in her chest. "And the pregnancy?" Alexander's smile was soft, genuine. "Well, that particular fiction might become reality sooner than we planned." Laura stared at him, understanding dawning with a mixture of joy and terror. "Alexander, Laura Bennett Carlyle, will you marry me? For real this time. No contracts, no exit strategies, no performance requirements. Just two people who found each other in the middle of an elaborate lie and decided to build something true." Below them, Manhattan sparkled with the dreams of 8 million people. Above them, stars wheeled in patterns older than ambition, older than money, older than the carefully constructed lives that brought people together and sometimes, if they were very lucky, taught them what love actually looked like. "Yes," Laura whispered, meaning it in ways she'd never meant anything before. The board announced their decision the next morning. Alexander Carlyle would remain as head trustee, his leadership confirmed by unanimous vote. Sebastian's threatened exposure never materialized, perhaps because he realized that destroying a genuine love story would make him look petty rather than principled, or perhaps because even he understood that some victories weren't worth the cost. 6 months later, Laura and Alexander were married again, this time in a small ceremony with only their closest friends, no cameras, no performance requirements, and no one to convince except themselves. The pregnancy, as it turned out, wasn't fictional for long. Their daughter was born the following spring, a tiny person who would never know that her parents' love story had begun with a contract and a lie, who would grow up thinking that marriage was supposed to be exactly what theirs had become, messy and honest and brave and real. And sometimes, late at night, when Manhattan glittered beyond their windows and their daughter slept peacefully in the next room, Alexander and Laura would look at each other and marvel at how the best truth of their lives had begun as the most necessary lie. Love, they had learned, was not about perfect timing or careful planning. It was about finding someone worth fighting for, and then having the courage to stop pretending you weren't fighting for them. In the end, that had made all the difference. The end.